So now we're in chapter 2, bargaining failure. And the main question that chapter 2 asks is, are there systematic conditions under which non-hierarchical contractual resolution of market failure must be abandoned in favor of hierarchy? What does that question mean? And what it really gets to is, can we have markets or contracts being enforced without there being some kind of hierarchy in place? Like, can you contract all the parts of a business without you needing some formal management structure that everyone must attend to who is employed by the business? And this used to be the case. Prior to World War I, many firms were based on the contract system. And what would happen is an entrepreneur would get the workspace, whether it be a warehouse or what have you, bring in all of the raw materials necessary for production, and then contract out to several different firms the production process. And these firms would come in, work there, and get the products put out. And like, this was a great system at the time because it kept costs low and quality really high, because there would be a consistent check-in between each group of contractors as to what was happening in the production process. Like, they take their piece of material or whatever, their finished product, to the manager would check it, it would go back to the next step in the process, and you'd have this all the way through. And then it allowed for craftsmen to take pride in their work, and there was a lot of high morale, things you don't see in the current production processes. Foxconn is a great example of this. I might send you a link on that. So why was it replaced? And the biggest thing was because of team production processes. We've talked a little bit about this already, why group organization tends to fail to reach an efficient outcome. There's a social dilemma, right? And so as the technology advanced, you needed more and more cooperation across all stages of production and things to complement each other. And because production processes are really more than the sum of the parts, it's not just like an input-output. There's no real recipe there. And it seems like a recipe from the outside, but once you're doing it, production is far more complicated than you think it is. I'm not sure if any of you have ever engaged in blue-collar labor, but you would be surprised and amazed just how widely production processes might vary from your opinions. And we've seen this kind of in the last couple of months because of supply chains. People they estimate their supply chains or supply chain in general to be very elastic. It's very responsive. But we found in the past month or so, especially with masks and other medical devices, that supply chains are very inelastic. They're not going to change because contracts have already been established. People are already working on it. Technology just doesn't change overnight. There's a lot that goes in to uprooting an entire supply chain and then making it into something else. It's not as easy as people think it is. So I think the biggest thing probably was, though, that there's conflicts with management. Pretty much when you had the old system of contracting within a firm, you would have high profits, but where do those profits go to? Which part of the production process or supply chain is the most valuable? And we know from Alshin and Allen, who two people reference in your book a lot, that when you have more than one task within a production process, it becomes almost impossible to define which task makes the most value of the good, or makes up the value of the good relative to another, right? And so management was often underpaid relative to the craftsman, and this created some kind of power struggle in between the two. And this was coupled with the fact that because people were consuming more and more in the early 20th century, that with the contracting system, it was impossible to reach the returns to scale you have with an automated process. Returns to scale existed, and people saw them, and so they shifted their production away from that of a contracting system to something more that was in-house and hierarchical. There's a couple Coase papers that are presented in this chapter. I'm going to send them to you. His 1960 paper says that people will bargain themselves to an efficient solution, assuming there's no obstacles. And his 1937 paper, which really put him on the, his 1960 paper put him on the map, but he was writing the 1937 papers around and no one paid attention to it until 1960. And I was like, firms exist because of transaction costs that cannot be overcome in the market. And different institutions and market structures will change how and which firms integrate. So what he's really saying there, especially in the 1937 paper, we know that firms exist to transform one good into another good. But why do firms exist within a market? Because the market, if it's perfectly competitive, if there are no market failures, should result in the same allocation of goods or a better allocation of goods than one with firms. However, we know this is not the case. Why? Because of all the market failures we've talked about. Importantly, just transaction costs are so high that the market can't always overcome them. And so you need all of these different aspects of production to be put in one house or one building or one organization. That way that like you bypass the transaction costs, you bypass the contracting of every individual part that you're trying to move through a production process and have it all done without any contracting going on, because that significantly lowers the costs. And more importantly, in his 1937 paper, Coase argues that different institutions or different like markets, think of like the United States market versus China versus Singapore versus Thailand versus Argentina, etc. Like the different kinds of firms rise up and how their production processes differ, or they will differ greatly in between all these different market institutions, because every different market institution has a different makeup of constraints, and firms are trying to bypass those constraints or like work within those constraints to get their products out. So this chapter really focuses on like the difference between bargaining and hierarchy, and like which one's better, or like when are they useful. And so some of the advantages of bargaining is really that like over hierarchy. It's hierarchy, you might need to use coercion. And coercion is not always a great thing. In fact, generally, I would argue most of the time not a great thing. Voluntary contracts, like when you're bargaining voluntarily, like they're more flexible. And then inside of a hierarchy, management doesn't have to seek the right incentives for their employees. They have to seek the incentives for their business structure. But then hierarchy has some advantages over bargaining. Mostly that like transaction costs could be too high, and so you need to impose the hierarchy to bypass all of those. And then no single contract can account for all possible contingencies. And the more contingencies you have, the negotiating cost of the contract gets higher and higher and higher and higher. And depending on the property rights, like you can have a various amount of situations where contracts become null because there is no enforcement of property rights. And just because you have two property right allocations resulting in equally efficient outcomes, it doesn't mean that they're equal in the side of the employees or the people who've been forced to engage in this behavior. And importantly, there is no political Coase theorem. And I'll send you a link to that paper as well. Why? Because the distributional implications of the allocation of property rights is at the very core of politics. There's no efficiency criteria there. It's just something that we argue over consistently. And so like there's no way to get past it. Like I said, I'll send you a paper on that explains it better. We have talked a lot about coordination games, including Battle of the Sexes. I don't feel like I need to explain that again. Just remember that a coordination game looks something like this. Oops. Forget it. All right. Movie, dinner, dinner. Oops. Movie, dinner. So you have player 1, player 2, and you know that they both like you've agreed to go do something together, a movie or a dinner, but you didn't specify which one. And so, one person will prefer to go to the movie, one person will prefer to go to the dinner, but neither prefers going somewhere without the other. And so you have to figure out how to do that. We've talked that really communication is the most important part of this, like figuring out where to go. There is a mixed strategy here, depending on the payoff structure. But communication is really what you need, because you need to form some commitment to the other person of where you're going to be going. Otherwise, you increase the chances of neither of you being where you want to be. Remember, it's better for one player to go where they don't want to go than it is for the other for neither player to show up at the same place. Unfortunately, revealing private information is also a social dilemma, because the information is private. And you want to glean more of what the other person's going to do than revealing your true preferences a lot of the time. And so this leads to a bunch of inefficient outcomes, and it can take you a really long time, a lot of like talking back and forth before true preferences are revealed. And by then, your costs of contracting are probably too high. You've been in a tender conversation for 3 weeks, haven't coordinated yet. It's probably time to give up. There's a lot of talk about Hobbes' Leviathan in the chapter, which is really important. I'm not going to go through all of it today, I don't think. We do need to talk about other stuff. So the case of the Fisher Body Corporation and General Motors is super important, because you have a producer and a supplier who are really closely connected. There's a thin market, meaning like there's very few suppliers and very few buyers in this market, and they're really close together. And so they need each other. And they get into an argument where GM is saying, well, your quality is not high enough. And remember, quality is hard to contract. Like, you can't know what the better alternatives of a producer are. You can think about what they are, but you don't know if they're producing at the highest quality. And so lots of arguments back and forth between GM and Fisher. Like, GM wanted Fisher to move closer, but Fisher didn't want to move closer to the GM production plant, because that tied them down in having to produce only GM products, or more GM products than they'd like. Eventually it came out that they vertically integrated. GM bought one of its suppliers. It bought Fisher Body, so that there could be no more disagreements or transaction costs or bargaining costs on what was getting produced by Fisher and sent to GM. In fact, instead, they used a hierarchical system to bring them in and merge, and it was over. And so the market really couldn't account for all of that, and and the cost of having the hierarchy was much cheaper for both firms, or at least for GM, because it was the buying firm. And you can see this today in the present day airplane industry, or the aerospace industry. The most complex components are the most likely to be produced internally. And like the airplane industry, like everything is really complex. I'll send you an article about how just getting the measurements wrong by a few millionths or 10 millionths of an inch for each individual part can result in really bad outcomes for building in a production process and building an airplane, because different computers round it differently, like depending on what their floating point operator is set at. And so being a few millionths of an inch off over hundreds of parts the length of 200 feet can set you off by several inches. And like I'll show you, I'll send that article over. All right. Next week, chapter 3 on boating.